So it's my honor to now introduce this evening's keynote speaker, Ellie Ade Kur. Ellie is an activist, author, and educator who co-founded the People's Pantry Toronto and works with Maggie's Toronto Sex Workers Action Project. In 2020, she organized mutual aid efforts that raised more than $400,000 in COVID relief for more than 30,000 people across Toronto and the GTA by expanding access to free meals, grocery care packages, and emergency survival funds for sex workers left out of Ontario's pandemic relief strategy. This evening, Ellie is going to get us thinking about getting involved and staying involved in mutual aid work. So Ellie, thank you so much for being with us this evening, and over to you.
Thank you so much for that and for this a really beautiful introduction. It's a lot when you say it like that. So I'm excited to kind of talk through some of it and some of what that work has looked like, because it's been a very difficult year. Thank you to FoodShare as well. We've appreciated through People's Pantry and through Maggie's, like so much of the direct and like immediate swift support that we've seen from FoodShare for sex workers experiencing food insecurity, and through our work through the People's Pantry as well. It's been quite a difficult time, and I think that the good food boxes that we've been offered have really made such a difference in people's lives. So we are all just like so deeply grateful for that continued support, especially in the context of like sex workers' rights organizing. It can be very difficult to get people to care about our communities and our lives. And so it is very meaningful to us. I think a lot about food insecurity and the feeling of food insecurity. And I think a lot about the fact that even from a very young age, I think, I had the feeling and the ideas of what poverty and what hunger felt like, even if I didn't necessarily have like the political language to articulate what I was experiencing, how I was experiencing it, and why. And so I also really appreciate the work that all of you are doing to not just meet people's needs in terms of providing things like food, but also meeting that with political education and discussing like how it is that we find ourselves in such a dire situation through like such a deadly pandemic. So it feels so important, like food insecurity itself it's so profoundly destabilizing and unsettling, and often it can leave you feeling quite hopeless. And I think that from a very young age and growing up through that experience, it can fundamentally sort of shift our perspective of the world, of our lives, how we're able to live, work, and thrive in our communities. It can be a very deeply and impactful experience that's very painful. So I believe that the work you do is a quality of life issue, it's a human rights issue, and ultimately it is an issue of life and death. And so I just want to express like how deeply grateful I am for all of us are for your support with food boxes. Because it really is the difference between being able to eat, being able to access food, and being able to live through something so awful. Maybe I'll talk a bit about the People's Pantry first. The People's Pantry it's a community meal and mutual aid project that's led by Black and Indigenous, queer and trans people of color. We provide free hot meals and grocery care packages to folks across Toronto and the GTA. We deliver things like free of charge, no questions asked, sort of right to your door through a bunch of partnerships with groups like FoodShare and the Bike Brigade. And since starting in March of last year, we've reached more than 30,000 people across Toronto and the GTA, which is it's really exciting to think about. I guess when I think about that, I'm also very overwhelmed and in awe. But I think maybe the point of how far People's Pantry has reached, and the point of most of what I'm about to say to you today, is that like showing up for one another and like putting the work into like all of the different little aspects of running like a mutual aid project and a community meal program. The small steps and actions that snowball and that grow over time. And I also just need to thank all of the co-founders, Jade DaCosta, Andrea Roman Alfaro, Jan Gracia, Paul Pritchard, and Michelle Huang. All the 500 plus volunteers and folks from the Bike Brigade and FoodShare as well for being able to do that work. And Maggie's it's Canada's oldest by and for sex worker justice organization. We do everything from direct street outreach and the dissemination of harm reduction supplies. We run drop-in programming and provide social, political, legal supports for sex workers in the downtown East End in Toronto that have been just virtually left behind by the provincial pandemic response. I'm also very appreciative that there's space to talk a bit about Maggie's here today, because a lot of people don't really understand how central sex workers and sex worker solidarity and human rights activism has been through so many of our social and political movements, all the way from Stonewall to the modern Pride today, anti-gentrification movements combating police violence and abuse, looking at gender justice, Me Too, creating mutual aid efforts and workers' rights campaigns. So many like sex workers, but specifically Black sex workers and Black trans sex workers exist at the intersections of criminalization, widespread stigma against sex work, navigating anti-Blackness and state violence. And because of all of those things sort of meeting in the middle, it's created circumstances where by and for organizations have really been some of the sole supports for many sex workers in our communities today. And I just also like to name people like Jenny Duffy, Monica Forrester, Estelle Davis, the entire board of directors at Maggie's, all of our peer outreach workers and staff past and present. There's been so much work that's gone into meeting sex workers in our community where they're at and kind of having to finance a lot of that ourselves. It's been very difficult, and so much of that work wouldn't have happened had it not been for the collective effort and dedication of all of these people. So I'm deeply grateful for that. I guess I'm here and speaking to you today, but I really want to stress that really I'm only here because of the work and the advocacy and heart and dedication of so many other people. I mean, even in the context of both of these projects, People's Pantry and Maggie's, I mean, I didn't produce or do those things like solo. Full disclosure, I can't cook. People are very lucky that the People's Pantry is not ran through my cooking. That'd be bad. But I think that it's sort of the point, and my point of everything here today is that, everything that we do in movement work and in movement building is not the product of any one person, but a collective sort of accumulation of people working together. I think a lot about civil rights leaders and human rights activists like Ellie Ade Kur. She was a Black civil rights leader, and she was very skeptical of sort of nonprofit charity models, but also this idea of like charismatic leaders, or there being like one leader who kind of like saves the day or builds a movement. And so she was very much like a very lengthy, like 5-decade career, but worked very much like behind the scenes in movements and really worked to build what she liked to call like leaderful movements, which really worked to build the power and the strengths and the capacities of people around her. And I think in my experience, and even over the last year, one of the things that I've really learned is that political organizing, or really any form of collective action, it looks like so many things. And I think in the last year, we've seen a lot of very visible rallies, protests, mobilizations, which are really beautiful things. And I think can sort of lead people to believe that movement building, a lot of it is very visible, which it can be and is, and that's a beautiful thing. But I think at its core, like really what it is it's also an internal dynamic, right? It's also about humility and openness and willing to try, fail, and course correct and collaborate with other people. And that just so many of us here today that participate in any form of social movement work we're really only here because of the people that came before us. And so I just believe that because of that, anything and everything we do in these spaces and in our organizations in any form of movement work is fundamentally about creating a path forward that's a little less dark for the people that come after us, just as the people who came before us did. I think it's really important to talk about this idea of solidarity, over charity, like now more than ever. I mean, especially with the mainstreaming of our movements, right? If you think, I just think back on the last 10 years and what it meant to say like Black Lives Matter, Black liberation, 10 years ago versus now, and the political climate, the social and the political climate is completely different. We've seen like an entire like mainstreaming and kind of like boom of industries around like equity, diversity, inclusion, and some of these like these buzzwords that in when mainstreamed and sort of divorced from their like radical political roots, their anti-capitalist roots, sometimes create spaces that look more to provide like palatable education, specifically to like more class privileged audiences. And spaces that kind of enjoy like the feeling of our presence and the feeling of diversity, or the image of it or the representation of it, but without really embracing like the fullness of our humanity and the fullness of our people, in terms of Black struggles. And I think a lot about Samaria Rice. Samaria Rice is Tamir Rice's mother. He was killed at 14 by police in Cleveland, and she recently released a really beautiful piece talking about like this sort of nonprofit industrial complex and how, it's really important that social movements like grassroots movements really sort of stay grassroots, right? Because when we think about some of the whole economies that are created around like book deals and speaking gigs and how we've created sort of like careers and nonprofits and entire industries off of being able to use the right words, like at its core, grassroots organizing is really about like showing up for those most impacted, those closest to the pain, with as much like support and resources as we can possibly provide. And so I think her critique is really important and something we need to be talking about, especially in the midst of increased police violence and abuse in our communities too. So just thinking about like who we're here for, who our movements and organizations are really showing up for, and how those build these like much longer and impactful legacies. I also think about Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement, which has taken off over the last few years. She talks a lot about this sort of mainstreaming of like anti-racist education, and what this looks like and what it means when, otherwise like fundamentally oppressive institutions like governments, like police forces, like universities, right, that still maintain like the powers of like state violence and abuse and replicate a lot of the violence and oppression that our communities are feeling. What does it mean when these people and these institutions adopt the practices of like anti-racist education? And how can we within our movement spaces ensure that this isn't just some like flavor of the day sort of thing, right? In terms of like the Me Too movement and really like supporting and centering like queer and trans, like Black survivors of violence, like making sure that these communities are like fundamentally like at the center of all of that work that we do. I'm just like naming off a lot of people, but just one more, another person I think a lot about as a writer, Dante Stewart. And he says that, Black people are human and we're worthy of love. We are not heroes. We are not villains. We're human, and our lives are not just about resistance. Our lives are not just lessons. Our lives are not just struggles or hashtags, and we're so much more than all of those things. I think that his words specifically like really, really sit with me and speak to me, especially over the last few years and seeing the rise of like Black liberation and racial justice efforts and how difficult it can be to have to organize and show up for our people in the midst of so much violence, like so much violence from police, so much violence and direct erasure from political leaders and supports, and dynamics that really make it so that like we are the ones that must show up for each other. We are the ones that must keep like speaking the names of our family and our friends and our community members to ensure that not only are we not exposed to violence, but that when violence does happen, that our communities constantly show up. So I say these things just to stress the importance of like grassroots collectives and organizations, and really stressing the fact that like our collective liberation doesn't come through nonprofits or charities or specific experts. It's not speaking gigs or book deals or sponsorships. It's not academics. It's not politicians. It's certainly not politicians. But it will be a collective struggle. And it will be waged by so many people that we see in our communities, many of you here in this meeting today, but also by so many people that have come before us, that paved the way for us, and that will come after us as well. And I think it's a really beautiful thing in a moment where we're experiencing so much struggle and what can feel like so many setbacks and such a great degree of loss in our communities, that we exist within a much larger constellation of our ancestors, of our community today, and of folks in the future as well. It feels very beautiful and like we can kind of place ourselves in that sort of constellation. I think a lot about solidarity and what it means to move in solidarity. I think solidarity is such a beautiful like concept in and of itself. I think it might actually be one of like the purest expressions of love and compassion that we hold for each other. And it's not solidarity and me showing up because you look like me, or solidarity because you have something for me or I could gain something. It's not showing up for you because it looks good in the moment or because I expect anything in return. It's showing up because I see your liberation and your struggle as directly connected to the liberation of my people and my community as well. And so it looks like, I show up for my friends and my family, my neighbors and my loved ones, but also a willingness to show up for the people that we don't know, like showing up for the people that don't necessarily share our experiences, our appearances, our kinship, but being ready to show up for people simply because it's the right thing to do. And I think it's like, I think it's such a beautiful concept and such a pure expression of what love is and what love looks like, right? Solidarity is not contingent on our friendships or on our interpersonal relationships or anything like that, but it's based on a shared commitment to freedom, to your freedom and your liberation and our collective liberation, which is really beautiful, because then it means like, listen, we don't even need to we don't need to have any kind of relationship. I don't need to know you. I don't need to like you to show up, right? But showing up means that your world and your safety and your future matters to me. And it matters to me because it's intrinsically connected to mine. Your future and your liberation and our collective liberation is connected to that of our ancestors, of our present, and of our future. And that's why it's so important just to show up. So I just love the concept of solidarity and think it's such a powerful model for all of us to integrate into our lives. I know the concept of like liberation can feel like a lot, and often it is. I think over the last year, we've seen like the million tiny fires and the profound degree of loss and pain and suffering we're seeing in our communities, how our people have been discarded in the context of sex work, like sex workers deliberately sort of mocked by the state. And it can feel very overwhelming to show up and extend that solidarity to people, but it's so necessary, like now more than ever, because it builds our capacity and lays the foundation for the future, right? It shows people the model on which to operate and build organizing and improve our organizing and do it better in the future. I think our liberation is generations in the making, but really what it is little motions and steps each and every day, right? The whole of a liberatory movement is like, it's greater than the sum of its parts. And I think we all have a role to play in that, sometimes in big ways and sometimes in small ways, but it all adds up. And I think in a beautiful way, in the same way that we and our skills can collectively sort of grow the revolution, the revolution grows us as well. And it tests us. It tests our values, our relationships, the alignment between what we say we believe and what we show we believe in, which I think is a really exciting and important opportunity for all of us. I also think that some of the most like revolutionary work and conversations that often we have are in some of our like the most like intimate like settings with friends and family and loved ones as well. There's a beautiful power there to be able to like collectively learn and build and grow. Sometimes through very uncomfortable moments, but I think often through like moments of accountability and learning that can be deeply fulfilling. I also just want to name the fact that in the last year, with People's Pantry and also with Maggie's, we've lost a lot of people, and we've seen like a profound degree of loss in our communities. Thinking about the epidemic of folks being like evicted from their homes, the situation with encampments, outbreaks in shelters, the overdose crisis we're currently dealing with. A lot of people working on the ground, and I think a lot of us more broadly are losing people, our friends, our family, and our community, and watching our people and personally experiencing what it is to suffer and to be left behind, and what it is to watch our people die because we are being left behind by the state. And I think that our commitment to like social movement work is really about sort of like addressing this and fixing this and honoring the lives and the will of the people that we've lost, and committing to never stopping that fight and showing up for them, showing up for our communities and for each other. And I see that Sheldamar has turned the camera on. I'm going to do one more thing. I was going to say one more thing. I thought a lot about what I was going to say and tried to have like a good, like happy spin on it. And maybe this kind of gets there. But one thing that sticks out to me that I think I've learned a lot over the last year and through all of my organizing is that there are no heroes. There are no singular individual people, single projects, individual forces of change, or even collectives that can do the work of like meaningfully challenging harmful and oppressive systems and institutions. It's no professor, it's no social worker, it's no academic, it's no politician, it's no charity or anything like that, because there's no one individual person coming, like no one is coming to save us from this crisis right now. But we also don't need heroes, and we also don't need someone else to come into our communities to save us, because we can do that collectively, like collectively leaning on each other, collectively building our movements, collectively committing to learn, to build, and to grow together is the antidote to the violence that we face in our communities today. So I think it's a really beautiful reality and concept. I think I got muted, but hopefully you understood. Hopefully I got through most of it. Sheldamar, I'm happy to pass it back to you, seeing the time.
Amazing. Wow, it's my first reaction. Ellie, thank you. You touched on so many things. And the chat box is going wild right now. I can see like constellation and what it means to be a real leadership. Shout out to Ella Baker, trusting youth and encouraging youth to get involved with work. So thank you, Ellie, like really and truly. So much food for thoughts. And thank you for all the important community work that you're also doing. There are no heroes. It's on us.